So we've got a whole bunch of interesting detachments, an anti-tank psyker and a patriarch that you can make very scary in melee, but hand in hand with a whole bunch of datasheet nerfs and a toning down of cult ambush. Let's talk about some of the biggest changes from Codex Genestealer Cults. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Genestealer Cult, and in this video I thought I'd do a roundup of some of the biggest changes out of the new codex, maybe not going over literally everything but just a few highlights, and then I'll aim to get a full codex review done sometime within the next 24 hours. Plenty of big changes, and it is interesting having a bunch of different ways to play the Genestealer Cult. Though at first impressions between the detachments and the datasheets, probably a bunch of points would need to go down a bit for the cultists to remain where they are at the moment. There definitely are a few cool things that have been removed, and a few of their standard damage combos are far less scary than they were, and it might well be that Genestealer Cult are looking a bit more hoardy if Games Workshop does want to keep them balanced. Now it's launch day for the Genestealer Cults and the Adept Sororitas, the codexes have gone on pre-order. If you are looking to pick them up at a discount, the places linked in the video description below should mostly have stock left of them. The battle forces have generally gone really quite quickly, though plenty of places still have the codex and the combat patrols. Element Games in the UK still seems to have stock of both, going at 20% off at the moment. And in general, if you were looking to pick up the book, then buying through a discount retailer will save you a bit of money versus the Games Workshop web store. As always, a big thank you to anyone picking those up through the links in the video description. Anything bought through them does help support the channel a bit. In any case though, let's get into the Genestealer Cult changes, and first up is a maybe slightly disappointing change to Cult Ambush. Maybe not insurmountably bad or anything like that, but definitely adds a bit more randomness to the army, and makes their core mechanic a touch less powerful. Broadly speaking, Cult Ambush is similar to how it was before, a 5+ chance for destroyed units to return to Cult Ambush and then turn up in the enemy's movement phase. They have the little movement minigame of putting down a blip token and then the enemy's got to try and get over towards it and take it out. You still get the +1 to the roll if the unit was destroyed on turn 1 or turn 2. Though unfortunately the benefit for +1 to that roll for battle line units has gone away, so things like Acolyte and Neophyte hybrids aren't going to be reliably respawning quite as much. Kind of a shame that one, and definitely takes a bit of power away from them if there aren't going to be as many coming back to the board for a second push later, and just generally means that there won't be quite as many of those units turning up. In practice, I think you could argue that there's a second nerf as well. One of the big things that kept Cult Ambush impactful was the ability for one command point to return a unit back into reserve. So if you put a blip token down somewhere super safe, and then you spend 1 CP to put them back into reserve, they can come back for another go anywhere on the board in your next movement phase. Unfortunately though, that stratagem doesn't exist anymore. The Host of Ascension has changed it to one that only triggers when the enemy shoots a unit, which is still a very good stratagem, but not quite as good at working with Cult Ambush. There's a bit more chance that the units that come back out of reserve are probably going to be sort of badly positioned, and might take another turn or so to get back in the fray. I'd hope that these changes will probably go with a hand-in-hand points drop at some point for battle line units, fingers crossed, in the actual update that follows the codex launch. It's definitely a reduction in raw strength and utility, so isn't exactly the most feels-good change for the army. For datasheet changes in the codex, there's no datasheets removed at all, not that we would have expected any really. And in terms of datasheets gained, there's 2. There's the new Benefictus with the anti-tank psyker that we'll take a look at next, and then the Acolyte hybrids have been split into a ranged and melee datasheet, one with auto pistols and the mining weapons, one with hand flamers and the demo charges. That's allowed them to give them different special rules and things, though demo charges won't be hitting anywhere near as hard as they used to be, unfortunately. There wasn't any Brood Brother datasheet to represent the Brood Brother Kill Team kit, which may be a slight shame really. Most attachments can't fill Brood Brothers, and it feels like the kit doesn't even mesh on perfectly with any one guard datasheet either, given the war gear variations. It does mean that that Kill Team kit, for 40k purposes, is just going to be representing Brood Brothers and making your infantry squads have a bit more of a Genestealer-y sort of feel to them, and most attachments can't fill them at all. I guess you could maybe use them to count as Neophytes, I suppose, for most armies, but it maybe is a bit of a shame that they didn't add a specific Brood Brother datasheet for these guys. For the new model that they did add though, the Benefictus is the model for the Biosanctic Broodsurge. It's a big-brained mutant who's basically a human zoanthrope with a Warp Lance psychic attack. Listed at 80 points in the codex, though this might definitely change given that they basically rewrite the points after each codex comes out. Plenty of new units in the past have had a very different points cost to their printed ones. His stat line is that of a weakish Genestealer support character, a 5+ invulnerable save, and 3 wounds. He doesn't really have any melee worth talking about, and he can lead Acolytes, Neophytes, and Metamorphs. What he does help with, though, is his psychic shooting, as you'd expect. The focused version of his psychic cascade is 2 attacks to 18-inch range, strength 12, AP 3, and damage d6 plus 1, or hitting on a 3+ with ignores cover, and usually with lethal hits as well, as he grants that to his lead unit's ranged weapons. It does mean that his squad will be really quite a serious threat to tanks and heavy stuff on the drop. A couple of effectively las cannon shots plus lethal hits for the unit should punch up a bit better than most. The lethal hits works out really nicely for seismic cannons and neophyte small arms, making them far more general purpose and stacking a bunch more saves, maybe coordinating with things like stratagems or the Ridge Runner as well. Otherwise, he gets a personal special rule for a 4+ invulnerable save that has to be triggered at the start of a phase once per game, which seems like a super meaningless rule on paper. At just 3 wounds and toughness 3, a 4+ invulnerable save isn't really going to save him against virtually anything. Overall, I feel like he at least seems interesting. Getting some serious extra shooting from reserve is pretty nice. Maybe the question though is more whether or not he is worth taking over the Primus with those full hit rerolls that he gets, as I feel like they're probably competing for the same sort of role. You can't attach him to a squad with other characters, unfortunately. For detachments, the Genestealer Cults have 5 of them. The Host of Ascension is renamed since the Index, basically the Ascension Day detachment, but with a few changes. They're sort of balanced and hitting hard from reserves, as you'd expect for the Genestealer Cult. The Biosanctic Broodsurge gives Pure Strains and Aberrants a lot more melee punch, and helps out units led by a Biophagus as well. The Xenocreed Congregation is a devoted throng that is maybe a bit of a hoardy build, with Acolytes, Metamorphs, and Neophytes all around the Primus Magus and the Acolyte Icon Ward. The Outlander Claw is a fast attack force, focusing on jackal bikes and transport vehicles, and the Brood Brother Auxilia is the half Genestealer Cult, half Guard formation, with some rules to support each of them. Focusing on the Brood Brother Auxilia first, they're the army that can field some allied guard if you want to. Previously you could use a quarter of your points allowance as Astra Militarum datasheets in Genestealer Cult, but unfortunately that's no longer the case. It is just the Brood Brother Auxilia that can take them, and they can take basically half of your army as guard. Mainly their mainline tanks and vehicles, as opposed to things like Auxilia of their own, and you can't take epic heroes or scions or aircraft and things. The Brood Brother Auxilia is sort of a bit weird in that it means that the guard units buff your Genestealer Cult shooting. If the guard unit shoots at an enemy unit, then the rest of your Genestealer Cult units get +1 to hit that same unit this phase. It's not a bad buff given that seismic cannons and demo charges hit on a 5+, but it maybe does feel like almost the wrong way round to an extent. For stratagems, there's a bunch of ones that have an interplay of both the datasheets. There's a Thumb 1 command point reactive move to move a non-vehicle unit 6 inches when the enemy deep strikes within 12 inches of them. That's quite a powerful move and means that you can basically get away from a charge or hide a unit behind terrain if the enemy tries to deep strike too close. That's quite fun. There's a 1 command point 1 for cult ambushing a Brood Brother infantry unit on a 3+, which could be alright on a big 20-man unit. There's a big 2 CP one to allow Brood Brothers to fire into an ongoing melee with a Genestealer Cult unit, which I think is okay. Probably best if they actually have a chance of destroying the unit and then the Genestealer Cult unit going on to destroy something else. There's also a Rescuer Blip one for 1 CP to redeploy a scrubbed out blip next to one of the Brood Brother vehicles. Otherwise, for enhancements, there's one way you can put a Brood Brother infantry unit to have an extra AP-1 when shooting, which I'd say is okay, nice enough for a big ranked up Deathcore Krieg block or a bunch of Kaschans with flamers. They're not really quite as good for buffing as orders on the whole. And one for an Overwatch on a 5+, which could work quite nice with a Primus and a whole bunch of Neophytes. You could have really quite a serious Overwatch threat there. Overall, at first impressions though, I feel like this detachment isn't going to be too strong. There's just not loads to support the actual guard units, and they lose a lot without orders or the lethal hits and things. Probably going to be a bit more of a fun and fluff detachment at best. Taking a look at those Acolyte hybrids, they're split into 2 datasheets as mentioned, and they break down like this. The Auto Pistol 1 farms command points on a 4+ on objectives. They've basically stolen that rule from the Neophyte hybrids who don't have it anymore. I guess maybe that's not the worst to have a cheap unit of them sat around on a home field objective, but they don't get those damage rerolls anymore on this unit. The Auto Pistol loadout now can't take demo charges. Instead, they just take the heavy mining tools, and they can have 3 per unit of 5 of them now, which is kind of nice. The mining tools got a nerf on strength. They're now 2 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3, but they do get anti-vehicle 4+. It means they aren't going to be very good against anything that's strength 6 to strength 9 and isn't a vehicle. But I guess you do get one more of them in the unit. Against vehicles and elite infantry sort of targets, you're probably fairly break even. And the leader still gets a fairly punchy profile at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1. I feel like these would need to be significantly cheaper than the unit as it is though. I suspect that they'll get a major points cut given the battle line changes and the lack of their damage rules. Otherwise, the Handflamer loadout is the shooty one. This is the one that still gets those damage rolls of reroll wound rolls of 1 against most units, and then reroll all wound rolls against things on objectives. They should be hitting with a trio of Handflamers, and then 2 demo charges. Unfortunately, the demo charges were heavily nerfed. They get D6 shots at strength 9, AP 2, damage 2 now, when previously they were strength 12, AP 2 and damage 2, and D6 plus 3 shots with blast. A bit of a nuke of a unit with that drop outside of 3 inches stratagem that could threaten to deal major damage to almost anything in the game when buffed. Again, as a result, I would hope that there's going to be a pretty serious points cut for these guys. Their scope of targets is just far less good than it was, and a bunch of detachments aren't going to have that delivery option of the 3-inch drop that the Host of Ascension still has for them. Looking at the next detachment, the Xenocreed Congregation is the one where you have Acolytes, Metamorphs and Neophytes guarding Primuses, Maguses and the Acolyte Icon wards. Their core rule I think is a bit of a weak one, re-rolling advanced rolls and charge rolls and getting a 3+ feel no pain to those specific leaders. I guess the charge roll thing isn't awful outside of Deep Strike, and there is a 1 command point stratagem to advance and shoot, so you could have some fairly speedy Neophytes. Otherwise, there's a fairly nice melee buff of +1 attack and +1 weapon skill, but your weapons gain hazardous. That could be pretty nice for some fighting Metamorphs or Acolytes, I suppose. A 2 CP ability to return a unit to the board anywhere, even if you don't have a Cult Ambush token. That could be quite good just for the positioning and getting them in the right position, as much as replenishing the unit. They do have to start somewhere within 9 inches of a board edge though, so I guess that still limits them a bit. And there's one for advance and charge, and re-rolling hit rolls against something that killed a Primus Magus or Icon ward. Otherwise, there's quite a nice buffing one to allow you to re-roll a Cold Ambush roll per turn. That feels like that's a bit of insurance against having units fail things too many times. And there's an interesting anti-character one with +1 to hit and wound for their unit against a character keyword unit. That could be quite nice, dropping with a bunch of Neophytes maybe. And certainly all very savage with Metamorphs in combat. There are certainly a bunch of interesting things here. Maybe a little bit more support with melee with advance and charge, and the damage boost one. Definitely feels like a detachment that might play a bit differently to the Host of Ascension with the shooting damage kind of buffs it has going on. There are some fairly major changes to the other battle line unit in the Neophyte hybrids as well. Seismic cannons might have been a bit of a too obvious choice for Games Workshop, as it seems they've reduced them from Rapid Fire 4 and Rapid Fire 6 down to 2 shots and 4 shots now. So really quite a big blow for them. That hurts the damage output of this unit by a lot. Unfortunately, that's not all though, as their mining lasers dropped from strength 12 to strength 10, and their core rule has taken a bit of a side grade. As mentioned, the Acolytes stole their command point grabbing one. So instead the Neophytes have got sticky objectives, admittedly not really the worst rule in the world, particularly for an army that might be warping around the table a bit. Feels like that will help them out a little bit in the objective game. Again though, I feel like, as I've been saying for most of the Genestealer Cults so far, if they are going to take these nerfs, they'll need a points cut to compensate for them, particularly in line of less battle line respawning. Next up, I feel like one of the more fun formations is the Biosanctic Broodsurge. In general, in Index Genestealer Cult, it's been very shooty in Ds without too many melee units taken to the field, and this one does feel like a unit that's going to give some very direct buffs to melee. Basically, all of its rules revolve around pure strains, patriarchs, abominants, aberrants, and the biophagus and any units that they can join. And the core rule is a nice easy damage boost, +1 to charges, which could mean that you could get an 8-inch charge out of Deep Strike, and then a +1 attack on the charge, so 5 attack pure strains or 4 attack aberrants. For some of the fun stratagems, they've got a +1 to wound for the detachment units against monsters or vehicles. That's enough to make the aberrants punch up a bit more. I should even have the pure strains slicing off a bunch of damage. There's an extra +1 to charge one, and getting more +1s to charge if you declared on multiple different units. Though I would say that probably most of the rest of them are a bit on the situational or mid side of the power spectrum. Things like reactive moves for pure strain blips, some mortal wounds on character death, and extra piling range and things. For the enhancements, there are a couple of fun ones though. There's the Infiltrate one here, which has been taken from the Host of Ascension. It still means that you can have a big scary Aberrant unit start in the midfield alongside an Abominant or a Biophagist. And there's one to make one of your leaders a lot scarier, an extra pip of AP and damage for either an Abominant or a Patriarch. That one does feel pretty standout for a Patriarch in particular. Having AP 3 and damage 3 on those twin linked claws makes him really quite general purpose from being a little bit tame. Pure strains are fairly similar, though I feel like the shine might be taken off this attachment a little bit by nerfs to Aberrants. They've taken some very big profile nerfs, and as with the troops, again they're going to need a points cut if they're going to remain the same sort of strength. They're still the same toughness 6, 5+ save, and 3 wound models, with -1 to wound if you've got a character attached and strength is greater than toughness. But basically they have got weaker in terms of defense as their 4+ Feel No Pain became a 5+, so they aren't going to be quite as monstrous and tricky to put down. And then their melee has taken really quite a serious nerf, dropping down from strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 to strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2. That's really quite a world of difference on the profiles there, going to be a bit less efficient against things like standard Space Marines due to the lower strength output, they'll still be quite good against them. But it's really quite a big deal for taking out any enemy 3 wound infantry or any enemy tanks and vehicles. And a unique profile for the hypermorph weapon with their stop sign and their tail has gone as well. That's just been folded into the new profile. I feel like Games Workshop might just be trying to go for an Aberrant squad that doesn't cost quite as crazy many points in game. It was a bit weird having a unit of 10 of them and an attached character cost something along the lines of 440 points. So maybe the idea is that they'll cost far less than that, but just have less damage and defense, but still maybe have the overall similar sort of role. From their damage changes though, it definitely feels like they're going to gravitate towards destroying sort of medium infantry a lot more than enemy tanks and vehicles, as they could punch off a bit against before. For the Abominants part, he's now 4 attacks, but no longer grants sustained hits, he's given them fights on death instead. Getting back to the core cult detachment with the Host of Ascension, the core rule is still similar, sustained hits and ignores cover when you arrive from reserve, whether that's being set up on reserve from actual deep strike or coming back in cult ambush, and then the buff lasts until your fight phase. Probably the 3 biggest blows to the detachment are that they've lost the return to reserves at the end of the enemy turn stratagem. That was just very good for spookily taking your units around and placing them in different places around the table. They no longer have that powerful can't shoot me outside of 12 inches stratagem, which is always a really disruptive one. And that infiltrate type enhancement has gone that was often used on Aberrants. As mentioned, that one's gone to the Biosanctic Broodsurge. Otherwise, a few of the stratagems are similar, some have been tweaked. The one that was +1 to hit and extra AP has become just critical hits on a 5+, so triggering the sustained hits for the unit. Potentially if you had a Benefictus in the unit, then that could be lethal hits on 5s as well. Still quite a nice shooting buff, but won't help out against high AP things as much. Return to the Shadows I still think is very interesting, but it's just not quite as reliably usable. You now use it on a unit that's taken casualties against enemy shooting, and then after that shooting has been resolved you get to return your units back to reserve. And that could still be kind of problematic for the enemy if they wanted to line up and delete one of your biggest threats with multiple shooting things. After the first thing is fired you can just have them fade away, which is really quite a powerful move to pull off. Otherwise the drop just outside of 3-inch stratagem is now restricted to battle line units, though in general that was mainly the things that it was being used on anyway. It might have a little bit less relevance for demo charges given that they're not quite as threatening as they were. Still a 10-man squad of them could make a nasty mess of some elite infantry where you're triggering the blast keyword, but they've certainly been reined in. Otherwise, for enhancements, there's a new one for a once per game plus 2-inch to charge, so budgeting a command point reroll, that's a pretty reliable way to get a squad out of deep strike and straight into melee. Could actually be genuinely interesting for some melee loadouts there. Could be a way to get some Aberrants into combat, or maybe even use it out of a truck. Another quite good one is for lethal hits at range on the turn of arrival. It means that you could have that on a Primus alongside the critical hit stratagem in a turn, then re-roll everything that isn't a 5+, and watch the Neophyte hybrids get an absolute massive amount of lethal and sustained hits to stack on the foe. That combo does seem pretty good, and I feel like you'd certainly have one Neophyte hybrid unit that shoots incredibly hard with this. Otherwise, for a couple of more positive datasheet changes, the Patriarch is no longer an epic hero, so you can take enhancements with him. He still has to be Warlord though, so I guess he's still taking one of him. He can also ride in Goliath trucks without penalty anymore. He is no longer excluded on their datasheet. Otherwise, the Outlander Jackals skirmish bikers, they've gained stealth, so aren't quite as easy to take down at long range. I still wouldn't exactly say they're tough for the cost, but that's definitely going to help them as their roles often to be on the front line early. Finally, talking of those Jackal bikers, there's the Outlander Claw. This one's the detachment for the fast-moving Genestealer Cults, focusing on Jackals, Ridge Runners, and Transports. Feels like the one that's themed around the Combat Patrol box set. Their core rule's a bit of a curious one, doubling the objective control of mounted and vehicle units, and Outlander Jackals getting the sticky objective type rule, which is handy enough given that they'd be scouting forward into the midboard. You can still access that rule from Neophyte hybrids, so it's maybe just a little bit less overwhelmingly important to have here. I think it's alright, but it's not a rule that adds any raw strength at all, it just helps out with a bit of objective play. I guess it would mean that you could zoom these up pretty fast and take objectives off the opponent and deny them primary points. Otherwise, they do have a bunch of support stratagems for the bikes and vehicles. A 4+ invulnerable save for Jackals at range does make them genuinely quite hard to take down. There's a -1 damage one for a truck or rock grinder, again will make them a lot more solid, though I still don't think they'd be exactly unkillable with that. There's a 6-inch reactive move one for Jackals or Ridge Runners when the enemy moves within 9, always handy for units that are venturing up the board. And a fun 1 command point return to reserve ones for bikers and vehicles within 9 inches of board edges. Seems that this one got that tool as opposed to the Host of Ascension. Finally, for enhancements, there's a nice one for re-rolling hit rolls after you've gotten out of a transport. I guess could be okay with a Benefictus with a bunch of Neophytes or Acolytes, I suppose. The Primus still gets that, so it'll be redundant. And there's one to make the Jackal Alpha's sniper rifle a debuff weapon, given the thing that it hits a -1 to hit. I guess that's not terrible added value if you were already taking one of them alongside those Jackals anyway. Overall, from first impressions, I'm a bit more mixed on this one. Compared with the Sisters Codex, I think my main take was that if they're going to remain their same sort of strength, you are going to need a lower points cost for quite a bunch of units in the Codex. Overall, the detachments do maybe feel a little bit weaker than the Ascension Day detachment from the Index, though not say that that's the be-all and end-all really. So hopefully Games Workshop manages to wind them up being fairly balanced. Probably from initial impressions, it might well be the Host of Ascension that still looks like the overall strongest to me. Perhaps the Biosanctic Broodsurge could be a fun one for a more melee-focused build. That would have to presume that both the Pure Strain Genestealers and the Aberrants were strong though. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Codex down in the comments below, and hopefully I'll be back in the not too distant future with a full review of Codex Genestealer Cults, going through everything in a little bit more detail. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.